I want you to just imagine for a second that you are standing at the peak of this massive high mountain.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. So you're up there and you are looking down at this sweeping, totally beautiful valley right below you. You see a river winding through the center, maybe some dense forests clinging to the slopes, maybe a little town nestled down in the floodplains.
A very idyllic picture.
Exactly. And for centuries, I mean, literally centuries, if you asked the absolute greatest scientific and geographical minds to explain what you were looking at, they would have told you something very specific.
They'd tell you it was all part of a plan.
Yes, a divine, harmonious, completely perfect master plan. They believed that the valley, the river, the plants, and the people down there were this highly ordered universe. The physical globe was quite literally created specifically for human use.
And that wasn't just a fringe theory either. That was the absolute, unquestioned consensus of the time.
Right. And then along comes this guy, a guy who wasn't even a geographer by training, by the way. He takes a 5-year boat ride, he publishes a book, and he just completely shatters that entire worldview.
Just completely dismantled it.
So today, we are going on a deep dive into the fallout of that exact shattered paradigm. We are going to look at how Charles Darwin's biological theory of evolution basically accidentally rewired the entire study of the Earth.
And, the sheer magnitude of this shift really cannot be overstated. We are talking about dismantling the fundamental philosophy of how humanity understood its place in the physical world.
It's massive. But to really grasp what Darwin disrupted, we have to kind of zoom in on that scientific baseline you mentioned, right? The mindset of the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Exactly. The prevailing philosophy of science, and particularly geography at that time, was this concept called teleology.
Teleology. Okay, let's break that down for the listener.
So teleology is basically the explanation of phenomena by the purpose they serve rather than by mechanical causes.
Okay, so it's less about how did this rock get here and more about what is the profound purpose of this rock being here.
Yes, exactly. In the context of geography, it meant viewing the Earth not as this dynamic, chaotic system of physical laws, but as a purposeful, finished creation.
So it's kind of like reviewing a play where the set was built perfectly for the lead actor. Like every prop, every spotlight, every trapdoor was put there by a master director specifically to serve the star of the show.
Yeah.
And in this case, the star is humanity.
That captures the mindset perfectly, yeah. And the most prominent geographers of the era operated entirely within this framework.
Right, like Carl Ritter.
Yes, Carl Ritter.
Yeah.
He is widely considered one of the founding fathers of modern geography. He lived from 1779 to 1859. And his magnum opus was this massive multi-volume work called Erdkunde.
And he was like a hardcore teleologist.
Yeah, devout. He possessed this profound belief in an ordered, harmonious universe determined by a divine creator. For Ritter, the Earth was essentially a teleological organism.
Okay, wait. When you say he viewed the Earth as an organism, do you mean that metaphorically? Like how we might casually say, oh, New York City breathes? Or was he being literal about the geography?
No, he was being remarkably literal.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Ritter argued that the shape of the continents, for example, was not accidental at all. He believed their specific form, their location, their climate, all of it enabled them to play a designed role in the development of humankind.
That is wild.
He viewed the Earth as this unified body, and the continents were its individual organs, each with a specific function assigned by a divine plan.
So he literally thought, like, Europe is the brain or Africa is the heart or something like that.
He essentially did, yes. Through his writings, he explicitly tried to prove that just as the human body is designed to house the soul, the physical globe was completely designed to house and nurture mankind.
I mean, I have to admit, that is a very comforting way to view the universe.
It is. It's very reassuring.
Everything has a place, everything has a reason, it's static, it's peaceful, and humanity is sitting right there at the very center of the design.
But then, of course, Darwin comes along.
Right, Darwin comes along and proves there is no director. The actors are literally building the stage while actively fighting for survival.
It's a brutal reality check.
It really is. So how do we get from this peaceful divine harmony to a brutal dynamic struggle? I think it's so fascinating that this huge intellectual revolution starts with, well, kind of a wealthy kid who wasn't even a particularly good student.
It's true. Charles Robert Darwin's early life certainly did not broadcast his future as this revolutionary scientific figure.
Not at all.
He was born on February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, England.
Yeah.
And he came from a very wealthy, distinguished background. His father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a highly successful physician.
So the pressure was kind of on for him to be a doctor, too.
Exactly. The expectation was that Charles would follow a similar, respectable professional path.
Right, so they ship him off to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. But from what I've read in our sources for this deep dive, he was entirely uninspired by traditional academics.
He really was.
He didn't like the lectures, and he was reportedly just horrified by the surgical theater, which, to be fair, in the 1820s, surgery was done without modern anesthesia.
Yeah, that would definitely make anyone squeamish. The traditional medical curriculum just did not suit him at all.
So what did he do instead?
Well, he did eventually obtain his degree in 1831, but with no special distinction whatsoever. But the key is that while he was neglecting his medical studies, he was intensely pursuing his actual passion.
Which was just amateur natural history, right?
Yes. He spent his time observing coastal marine life, collecting beetles, and studying the natural world with this level of granular obsession that his formal professors often just completely overlooked.
I love that. He's just out there hoarding beetles instead of going to class. And it's that specific obsession with observation that gets him an invitation to join the crew of the HMS Beagle in 1831.
That was the turning point.
Right. So he sails as a naturalist on this expedition to survey the west coast of South America and the Pacific Islands. And this is a 5-year voyage.
A huge commitment.
Setting sail in the 1830s for half a decade is a massive undertaking, and it fundamentally alters the trajectory of human knowledge. But I think it's so interesting that it wasn't just what he saw on the boat, it was also what he was reading in his cabin.
Oh, the reading material was arguably just as critical as the physical journey itself.
What was he reading?
During the voyage, Darwin heavily immersed himself in the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which had just recently been published.
Okay, Lyell, let's dig into him for a second.
So Lyell was a geologist building on the work of earlier thinkers, and he was arguing forcefully for a concept known as uniformitarianism.
Uniformitarianism, that is a mouthful. Let's break that down because I know it stands in direct opposition to the prevailing geological theory of the time, which was called catastrophism. So, catastrophism is the idea that the Earth was shaped by massive, sudden, divine events, like a global flood that just carves out a massive canyon in a few weeks.
Right. Big, dramatic, sudden changes.
So what was Lyell proposing instead with uniformitarianism?
Lyell proposed that the physical features of the Earth, so the mountains, the valleys, the deep canyons, and the rock formations, they were not formed by sudden divine catastrophes.
Okay.
Instead, they were formed by slow, continuous, everyday processes. He argued that the exact same forces we see operating today, wind blowing sand, rain eroding soil, rivers cutting through limestone, these were the forces that shaped the entire planet.
Oh, wow. So a river doesn't just fill a valley that God carved out for it. The river actually carves the valley itself, just grain of sand by grain of sand.
Precisely. And the necessary consequence of that mechanism is the concept of deep time.
Deep time.
Yeah. If a gentle river carved the Grand Canyon, the Earth could not merely be a few thousand years old, as the theological consensus of the time suggested.
Right, because that would take forever.
It must be incredibly ancient, millions, perhaps billions of years old. Lyell even suggested that fossils found embedded high up in mountain rocks were evidence of marine animals that had lived millions of years ago, in seabeds that had been slowly uplifted over unfathomable stretches of time.
Okay, so picture this. Darwin is standing on the deck of the Beagle, and he's absorbing this totally radical idea that the Earth is ancient, dynamic, and constantly changing in these imperceptible ways.
He's looking at the world through a completely new lens.
Exactly. And with that specific lens, he arrives at the Galapagos Islands, which is about 850 kilometers west of Ecuador, and this is where the foundational observations for his theory of evolution actually take place.
The Galapagos provided a truly unique natural laboratory for him.
What did he see there?
Well, Darwin noticed something peculiar about the wildlife across this archipelago, particularly the finches.
The famous Darwin finches.
Right. He observed that each individual island supported its own distinct form of finch. But what was crucial was the mechanical relationship between the bird's anatomy and its specific environment.
Like how they matched their surroundings.
Yes. For example, finches residing on islands where the primary food source was hard seeds, well, they possessed thick, strong beaks capable of cracking them.
Makes sense.
Conversely, finches on islands where insects were the main food source had developed thinner, sharper beaks suited for probing and snatching.
So they were basically hyper-specialized tools.
Precisely.
But, Darwin doesn't just look at a bird beak, shout Eureka, and write his book right there on the beach.
Far from it.
He actually comes back to England in 1836 and spends the next 20 years just agonizing over these observations.
He was incredibly methodical.
Right, because he knows the species are changing to fit their environments, but he's missing the engine. He needs to know exactly how they change. And the missing puzzle piece comes from a completely unexpected discipline, economics.
The cross-pollination of scientific disciplines is so often where the most profound breakthroughs occur.
It really is. So who is the economist?
In 1798, an economist and demographer named Thomas Malthus published an essay on the principle of population. And Malthus was mainly concerned with human demographics and the limits of agricultural production.
Right. Malthus laid out honestly, a very grim mathematical reality about human starvation.
He did.
As I understand it from the sources, he argued that human population, if it's left unchecked, increases geometrically.
Yes, exactly.
So it goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It just multiplies exponentially.
Very rapidly.
But our ability to grow food, so agricultural production, that only increases arithmetically because you can only add like one more acre of wheat at a time. So the food supply only grows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That's the crux of the problem.
So if Darwin is reading Thomas Malthus, how does an economic theory about human starvation give a botanist the missing link for plant and animal evolution?
Because Darwin realized that Malthus's brutal mathematical reality applied far more strictly to the natural world than it even did to human societies.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it. Every single plant, insect, and animal species produces vastly more offspring than the environment can possibly sustain.
Right.
An oak tree drops thousands of acorns. A frog lays thousands of eggs. If every single acorn grew into a massive tree and every frog egg reached adulthood, the world would be completely suffocated by oaks, and we'd be knee-deep in frogs within just a few generations.
That is a terrifying visual.
But that doesn't happen. Population sizes remain relatively stable in nature.
Because the geometric growth of the frogs hits the ceiling of arithmetic resources, there literally isn't enough sunlight, water, or food for all of them to survive.
Exactly. And that realization revealed the invisible engine of nature to Darwin. It wasn't a peaceful, harmonious garden at all.
So Ritter was totally wrong.
Completely. It was an eternal, slow-motion battlefield. There is a constant, invisible struggle for limited resources going on in every forest, ocean, and desert.
Okay, so this is where the variation of the Galapagos finches suddenly makes total sense. If there is a massive life or death struggle just to survive until tomorrow, any tiny advantage matters.
That is the synthesis. That's the breakthrough. If an organism is born with a slight, random variation, say a beak that is just 1 millimeter longer, allowing it to reach a bug that the others cannot reach, that organism has a statistical edge in the Malthusian struggle.
It gets the food, the others starve.
Right. It is more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. And when it reproduces, it passes that advantageous genetic trait onto its offspring. The organisms without that advantage starve, or they get eaten, and their traits are simply removed from the gene pool.
Survival of the fittest.
Exactly.
Okay, so this brings the timeline up to about 1859. Darwin has been sitting on this explosive synthesis of Lyell's deep time, Malthus's competition, and his own observations of adaptation for 2 whole decades.
He was sitting on a powder keg.
Why did he wait so long? Was it just him being a rigorous scientist, or was he aware of the absolute philosophical bomb he was about to drop on society?
Oh, he was acutely aware of the philosophical and theological implications. He knew he was dismantling the teleological worldview of a divinely ordered creation.
Which was dangerous back then.
Very. He knew the backlash from the religious orthodoxy would be severe. However, his hand was eventually forced.
Right, the letter.
Yes. He received correspondence from another naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace had been conducting surveys in the islands of Southeast Asia, and Wallace had independently arrived at almost the exact same mechanism of natural selection.
I mean, I just cannot imagine the panic. You're working on a world-changing theory in secret for 20 years, and then you just get a casual letter in the mail from halfway across the globe saying, "Hey, I had this cool idea. What do you think?"
It definitely prompted some immediate action. To maintain their scientific integrity, they actually made a joint presentation of their findings to the Linnean Society in 1858.
But Darwin is the one who gets the book out.
Right. The following year, Darwin published the definitive, exhaustive account on the origin of species by means of natural selection. That was in 1859.
1859. This is one of the most poetic historical coincidences that we found in our sources.
It really is striking.
The two founding fathers of teleological geography, Karl Ritter, who we talked about, and Alexander von Humboldt, the men who truly believed the Earth was a divine, static organism designed for humans. They both died in the exact same year, 1859.
The symbolism there is just profound. The old geographical paradigm literally perished the exact same year the new biological paradigm was published.
It's like the changing of the guard.
Absolutely.
Oh,
The
yeah.
belief in a static, purpose-driven Earth was decisively replaced by a dynamic, mechanism-driven Earth. And, Darwin pushed this even further a few years later.
Oh, with the human stuff.
Yes, in 1871 with the publication of The Descent of Man. In that book, he explicitly removed the barrier between humanity and the rest of the animal kingdom.
So humans weren't special anymore.
Nope, humans were not the designated lead actors on a divine stage. We were simply another species that had managed to adapt and survive the Malthusian struggle.
Okay, so to truly understand how this completely rewired the discipline of geography, we need to clearly lay out the three pillars of Darwin's theory, because the geographers we're about to talk about are going to take these specific pillars and try to build their own crazy theories on top of them.
That's a good approach. The three foundational pillars are, first, the struggle for existence.
Based on Malthus.
Right. Based on Malthus, there is continuous, unavoidable competition for finite resources among all living things.
Okay, pillar one is struggle.
Second is variation. Randomness and chance produce physical variations within individuals of the same species.
So no two organisms are perfectly identical.
Exactly. And third, survival of the fittest and natural selection. Those organisms whose random variations make them best suited to their specific environment are the ones that survive to pass on those traits.
I really want to focus on that phrase for a second, survival of the fittest, because it's so frequently misunderstood, even today.
Oh, constantly.
It's really common to equate fitness with, like, apex physical dominance, doing push-ups and being the biggest predator. But in Darwinian terms, fitness is strictly about reproductive success within a specific ecological niche, right?
That is a critical distinction to make.
Like a blind, sluggish cave salamander is highly fit for its dark, low-energy environment, whereas a heavily muscled Siberian tiger would basically starve to death in that exact same cave within a week.
Right, because it requires too many calories.
Exactly. Fitness is about the puzzle piece fitting the whole, not the strength of the piece itself.
That is a perfect analogy, and it's one that many subsequent thinkers, unfortunately, totally failed to grasp. But the immediate scientific reaction to Darwin's mechanism was overwhelming.
Even with the religious pushback.
Yes, while the religious orthodoxy vehemently attacked him for challenging divine creation, the scientific evidence he presented was so robust that it quickly became the new, prevailing scientific orthodoxy.
So, Darwin drops this biological bombshell. But our mission today is geography. How does a theory about finch beaks and genetic inheritance completely rewrite the study of mountains, rivers, and national borders?
Well, the initial impact was felt most heavily by physical geographers and geologists.
Because of the timeline.
Exactly. Darwin's theory required vast, almost incomprehensible spans of time for biological evolution to occur. He needed Lyell's deep time to make the math work.
Right.
So in a reciprocal manner, geologists began focusing heavily on systematically mapping rock strata and analyzing fossils to trace this evolutionary timeline. Physical geography, specifically geomorphology, which is the study of landforms, became the dominant field of geographic research in the late 19th century.
It's like a scientific feedback loop. Darwin proved that biological life requires millions of years to evolve, but for the biologists to prove their timeline, they needed the geologists to confirm the Earth was actually that old.
Yes, they needed each other.
And that pressure forced physical geographers to look at the Earth completely differently, which introduces a major figure in American geography to our story, William Morris Davis.
Ah, Davis, yes.
What exactly did Davis do with Darwin's theory?
Davis observed the biological framework of evolutionary change over time, and he basically attempted to map it directly onto inorganic matter.
He applied biology to rocks.
He did. He developed what he called the geographical cycle, which is also widely known as the cycle of erosion. He drew a direct biological analogy between the life cycle of organic life and the mechanical evolution of landforms.
So instead of looking at a mountain as a static, dead rock, he looked at it as an aging entity. He assigned it a lifespan.
Precisely. Davis proposed that landforms evolve through sequential chronological stages, mimicking a biological organism. He categorized these stages as youth, maturity, and old age.
A teenage mountain.
Effectively, yes. The mechanism he proposed involved rapid tectonic uplift, followed by incredibly long periods of erosion.
Okay, walk me through the stages.
Sure. So in the youth stage, the landscape features very steep, rugged mountains and rapid rivers that are cutting deep V-shaped valleys.
Very aggressive, lots of energy.
Exactly. Then, over millions of years of erosion, the landscape enters maturity.
Yeah.
This is characterized by softer, rolling hills and rivers that begin to erode laterally instead of just downwards, which creates wider floodplains.
Okay, it's calming down.
Right. And finally, the landscape reaches old age, having been eroded down almost completely to sea level. This forms a flat, featureless plain that Davis termed a peneplain.
Wait, hold on. I'm trying to picture the actual mechanics of this here.
Okay.
Because if survival of the fittest relies on genetic variation
Right.
and competition for resources and passing down those traits to offspring, rocks do not reproduce.
They do not.
A mountain doesn't have babies, it doesn't have DNA, it doesn't compete for sunlight. How did the scientific community just accept a biological analogy applied to a pile of granite? Isn't applying biological aging to a rock just fundamentally incompatible with physics?
Your skepticism is completely justified, and it highlights the core theoretical flaw in Davis's work. A flaw that, I should add, modern geomorphologists readily acknowledge today.
It just seems so obviously wrong.
It's akin to trying to use the rules of chess to play a game of poker.
Right.
You might technically hold a king in your hand, but the underlying mechanics of the game are completely incompatible. Davis was using the vocabulary of evolutionary biology to play the game of physical geology.
So why did it catch on so fiercely? I mean, why did an entire generation of physical geographers adopt a flawed metaphor?
Because the scientific community of the late 19th century was just utterly mesmerized by Darwinism.
It was trendy.
Very. The explanatory power of evolutionary thinking was so intoxicating and so culturally dominant that scientists across all disciplines attempted to force their observations into a Darwinian framework just to gain legitimacy.
Oh, so they wanted to sound Darwinian to get taken seriously.
Exactly. Darwin proposed a mechanism of random variation and natural selection. But Davis stripped away the randomness in the selection part and merely adopted the concept of linear historical change.
I see.
For Darwin, evolution was an unscripted process.
Mm-hmm.
For Davis, it became a predictable history, moving from A to B to C.
Right.
But despite lacking true Darwinian mechanics, Davis's deductive model dominated physical geography for decades because it provided a clean, easily understandable narrative for complex geological timescales.
It's a good story. People like a good story with a beginning, middle, and end.
They do.
So the physical geographers took the concept of time and aging and they forced it onto rocks. But what about the human geographer?
This is where it gets complicated.
Right, because if the environment shapes the bodies of finches over time, the logical and potentially very dangerous next question is, does the physical environment strictly shape human societies and human cultures?
And that exact question catalyzed the rise of environmental determinism, which became the predominant school of thought in human geography during the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Determinism, meaning the environment determines who you are.
Yes. Thinkers began to apply biological determinism to sociology and anthropology.
We are stepping into the territory of social Darwinism here, aren't we?
We are, very much so. A prominent German geographer named Friedrich Ratzel heavily adopted Darwinian concepts. In the 1880s, he published an influential work titled Anthropogeography.
And what was his main argument?
Ratzel proposed that human societies are deeply, irrevocably shaped by their physical environment. The core tenet was that similar geographical locations inevitably lead to similar modes of human life and social organization.
Okay, so under that logic, if a society develops in a cold, harsh, mountainous climate, they will inevitably develop a specific type of rugged, hardy culture. And if they develop in a lush, tropical climate, they will inevitably develop another type of culture. It implies that human destiny is basically just written by the soil and the weather.
That is the absolute essence of determinism. And these ideas were amplified even further when Ratzel's American student, Ellen Churchill Semple, introduced them to the United States.
Did she take it further?
She articulated this philosophy with striking rigidity. In her 1911 book, Influences of Geographic Environment, she wrote a very famous passage.
What did she say?
She wrote, "Man is the product of the Earth's surface. This means not merely that he is a child of the Earth, dust of her dust, but that the Earth has mothered him, fed him, set him to task, directed his thoughts, confronted him with difficulties that have strengthened his body and sharpened his wits.
Wow. I mean, that language completely strips away human agency.
It does.
It portrays the Earth as this grand puppet master, dictating human thought and social evolution simply through climate and topography.
It was a highly mechanistic, rigid view of human nature. And another geographer, Ellsworth Huntington, pushed this framework to its extreme conclusions.
How extreme.
In texts such as The Pulse of Asia and Civilization and Climate, Huntington actually posited that specific climatic cycles dictated the vitality and success of entire civilizations.
Wait, so the weather determines if your empire succeeds?
Essentially, yes. He advanced the argument that only the stimulating, highly variable climates of the temperate regions, specifically Europe and North America, could produce superior intellects and advanced civilizations.
Oh boy.
And he argued that tropical climates destined populations to lethargy and underdevelopment.
Okay, so historical records obviously indicate that these deterministic theories were heavily utilized by European and American powers in the late 19th century.
They were heavily weaponized.
Because they provided a scientific geographical rationalization for colonial expansion. By framing European dominance not as a political choice, but as the inevitable result of Darwinian survival of the fittest, dictated by a superior climate, imperialism was basically presented as a law of nature.
The application of these theories served to naturalize global inequalities. It made them seem scientifically mandated.
Which is incredibly dark.
However, to maintain a comprehensive view of the discipline's history, we must note that determinism was not the only interpretation of Darwin within human geography.
Right, there was some major pushback.
There was significant intellectual pushback.
Because, not everyone who looked at the natural world saw a brutal deterministic struggle. And this introduces one of the most fascinating figures in all of our sources for this deep dive, Peter Kropotkin.
Kropotkin was a truly remarkable intellect. He was actually a Russian prince who renounced his aristocracy to become an anarchist philosopher and a geographer.
Just a casual career change.
Exactly. He engaged very deeply with Darwin's writings, but his perspective was fundamentally altered by his own extensive geographical expeditions. Kropotkin spent years observing wildlife and human communities in the incredibly harsh, unforgiving environments of Siberia.
Okay, so what did he observe out there in the freezing cold of Siberia that contradicted the prevailing social Darwinist narrative of this endless, brutal competition?
He observed that in environments where the struggle against the elements was overwhelmingly severe, species did not survive by turning on each other.
What did they do?
They survived through cooperation. In his seminal 1902 book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, Kropotkin argued that sociability and mutual aid are just as crucial to evolutionary survival as competition.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So a pack of wolves hunting together in the Siberian winter is far more fit for survival than a single ultra-aggressive wolf trying to dominate everything alone.
Exactly. He pointed to ants building complex colonies, birds migrating in protective flocks, and mammals hunting cooperatively. And Kropotkin argued that humanity is no exception to this rule.
We are social animals.
Right. He posited that mutual aid, community support, and cooperation were the fundamental drivers of human evolution and societal progress. He fiercely opposed the deterministic idea that capitalism, class struggle, and imperial expansion were justified by natural biological laws of competition.
I love that perspective. Kropotkin suggests the environment is tough, sure, but its very harshness actually forces us to work together.
Yes, it bonds us.
And there was another major counter-movement to determinism that arose in France around this time, known as possibilism.
Yes, championed by the prominent French geographer Paul Vidal de la Blache.
And what was his take?
Well, he actually drew some inspiration from the later, more nuanced volumes of Ratzel's work, surprisingly. But Vidal de la Blache fundamentally rejected the rigid causation of environmental determinism.
Right.
He formulated possibilism, which operates on the premise that the physical environment does not dictate human actions. Rather, it merely sets certain physical limits and offers a range of possibilities.
Okay, let me try to put that into a modern context for you, the listener.
Go for it.
Determinism argues that living in a barren desert forces a society to become nomadic pastoralists. You have no choice. The desert makes you a nomad.
Right, that's determinism.
But possibilism argues that the desert is a highly restrictive environment, sure, but it still offers choices. A society can choose to be nomadic, or if they possess sufficient technology, capital, and cultural desire, they can build a sprawling, neon-illuminated metropolis like Las Vegas right in the middle of the sand.
That is a brilliant example.
The environment provides the canvas, But human ingenuity holds the brush.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the shift. Possibilism reinserted human agency, culture, and technological capacity back into the geographic equation. It acknowledged the environment's influence without completely surrendering human destiny to it.
Okay, so we've examined how Darwin's concepts were translated into geomorphology with, aging mountains, and we've seen human geography grapple with cultural determinism and possibilism. But we need to explore what happens when these biological analogies are scaled up to the macropolitical level. Because when geographers applied the concept of the Darwinian organism to the nation-state itself, the theoretical implications became profoundly impactful on world history.
This brings us back to Friedrich Ratzel, who actually pioneered the subdiscipline of political geography.
The determinism guy again.
The very same. In his 1897 work, Politische Geography, Ratzel took the biological metaphor to its ultimate conclusion. He conceptualized the nation-state not merely as a set of political boundaries on a map, but as an earth-bound living organism.
Wait, he literally analyzed the political state as if it were a biological entity governed by Darwinian laws.
Conceptually, yes. Ratzel argued that, much like any living organism in the Darwinian framework, a state cannot remain static. It is subject to the laws of growth and decay.
Just like an animal.
Exactly. Just as a plant requires expanding root space to absorb nutrients, or a finch population requires sufficient territory to forage for seeds, a healthy state must naturally expand its geographic territory to accommodate the needs of its growing population and its economic output.
And he coined a very specific, historically loaded term for this necessary spatial expansion, didn't he?
He did. He introduced the concept of Lebensraum, which translates directly to living space.
Lebensraum.
The theoretical assertion was that a state is biologically compelled to compete with weaker neighboring states for the space required to survive and thrive.
So it's the Malthusian struggle, but with countries.
Exactly. The health and survival of a nation were inextricably linked to its spatial expansion. Ratzel suggested that if a growing state is not contained by equally strong neighbors, it will naturally and inevitably overflow its borders, just as a thriving species expands its ecological niche.
It is a truly striking intellectual lineage. I mean, think about this. A purely scientific observation regarding how bird species adapt to food scarcity on isolated Pacific islands is transformed over just several decades into a theoretical geopolitical framework that naturalizes the invasion of neighboring countries.
It is a sobering reminder of how scientific theories can be detached from their original context and utilized to formulate political ideology.
Yeah. Impartially speaking, based on the historical context in our sources, how did this actually play out in the real world?
Well, the historical record illustrates this very clearly. In the 1920s and 1930s, Ratzel's geographic concept of Lebensraum was integrated into the emerging field of geopolitics in Germany.
Okay.
It transitioned from a purely academic geographic theory into a foundational element of actual state policy,
Which ultimately provided a pseudoscientific rationale for the aggressive territorial expansionism of the Nazi regime in the lead-up to the Second World War.
Yes.
The biological concept of the struggle for survival was invoked as a geographical mandate for conquest in Eastern Europe.
That is the stark historical reality of how the theory was applied in practice.
It's incredibly heavy.
It is. But while political geographers focus so intensely on those concepts of struggle and competition, it is really crucial to recognize that other geographers were drawn to an entirely different aspect of Darwin's writing.
Right, because Darwin didn't just see a war for resources. He also saw what he explicitly called the web of life.
Yes, the interconnectedness.
He recognized that the survival of the finch was dependent on the insect, which was dependent on the plant, which was dependent on the soil. It's all connected.
Darwin was profoundly observant of the exquisite adaptation and interrelated dependencies of all organic forms. And this perspective catalyzed the development of an entirely new scientific discipline,
Which was?
ecology.
Yeah.
In 1870, a German zoologist named Ernst Haeckel actually coined the term ecology. Haeckel defined it as the comprehensive scientific investigation of the total relationships of an organism to its organic and inorganic environment.
And geographers eventually recognized that this ecological lens could be applied to human societies without having to resort to that dark, rigid determinism we just talked about.
Precisely. By 1923, an influential American geographer named H. Barrows delivered this major presidential address to the Association of American Geographers.
What did he say?
He was advocating for a major disciplinary shift. Barrows argued that geography should abandon determinism entirely and redefine itself as human ecology, meaning the rigorous study of human adjustment and adaptation to the environment.
So the paradigm shifts. It goes from the environment dictates human action to how do humans actively organize, adapt, and alter their position within this complex ecological web.
Yes, much more dynamic framework. And this ecological framework deeply influenced one of the most prominent American geographers of the 20th century, Carl Sauer.
Sauer's a huge name in this field.
Very much so. In his landmark 1925 essay, The Morphology of Landscape, Sauer vehemently argued against environmental determinism. He introduced the paradigm of the cultural landscape.
The cultural landscape, what does that mean in practice?
Sauer proposed that the true task of the geographer is to study the process by which human populations take a raw, natural landscape and over time transform it through their culture, technology, and activities into a uniquely humanized cultural landscape.
Oh, I see. So we are no longer looking at humanity as just passive subjects of the environment.
Not at all.
We're looking at humans as active geological and ecological agents, leaving a distinct footprint on the Earth, like building terraces for farming or diverting rivers or, building Las Vegas.
Exactly. Humans are active shapers of the world.
Okay, but looking back at this entire century of geographical thought following Darwin's publication, a glaring inconsistency emerges from all our sources.
It does. It's the elephant in the room.
Right. We have Davis creating these rigid linear stages for aging mountains. We have Ratzel generating these strict deterministic laws for cultural development and state expansion. And they all aggressively cited Darwin as their intellectual foundation.
They absolutely did.
Yet, they seemingly ignored one of the most vital mechanical pillars of Darwin's actual theory.
This is perhaps the most profound irony in the entire history of geographic thought.
Break it down for us.
As we established earlier, the three pillars of Darwinism are struggle, natural selection, and variation.
Right.
However, Darwinian variation is fundamentally driven by randomness and chance.
Random mutations.
Yes, Darwin's evolutionary engine relies entirely on unpredictable, random genetic mutations. If a finch hatches with a slightly thicker beak, it did not happen because the finch needed it or because the environment willed it to happen.
It was just a fluke.
It was a random genetic roll of the dice that happened to offer a statistical advantage in that specific moment. True Darwinism is inherently probabilistic. It deals in likelihoods, not certainties.
But the geographers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries didn't want probabilism. They were seeking hard, inviolable laws.
The scientific culture of that era was still heavily influenced by Newtonian physics. Scientists across disciplines were totally obsessed with discovering clean, predictable, law-like systems.
They wanted geography to be math.
Exactly. Geographers, eager to establish their field as a rigorous predictive science, selectively extracted concepts from Darwin.
They cherry-picked.
They did. They adopted time to construct linear, predictable stages for mountain erosion. They adopted struggle to formulate rigid, deterministic rules for human culture and state behavior. But they willfully ignored the concept of randomness.
I mean, it's a classic case of cherry-picking data to fit a desired narrative. Acknowledging that genetic mutations and historical developments are heavily influenced by random chance makes mapping the world incredibly messy.
Too messy for them.
Right. It is impossible to write a universal predictive law of human geography if you have to admit that a significant portion of historical success or failure is determined by an unpredictable roll of the dice.
The result was that for nearly a century, geography operated under a highly deterministic, pseudo-Darwinian framework that Charles Darwin himself would likely have found completely unrecognizable.
He would have hated it.
He probably would have. It wasn't until the quantitative revolution in geography during the 1950s and 1960s that geographers finally began to incorporate stochastic processes, meaning mathematical models involving randomness and probability, back into spatial analysis and geographic theory.
Wow. Okay, let's trace the full arc of the journey we've taken today because we've covered massive ground.
It's been quite a ride.
We began on a high mountain, looking down at a valley through the teleological lens of the 18th century, believing the rivers and continents were static organs designed by a divine creator for human use.
The Ritter worldview.
Right. Then Charles Darwin embarks on the Beagle. He absorbs Lyell's concept of deep time, he observes the highly specialized finches of the Galapagos, and synthesizes Malthus's grim mathematics of population limits into the theory of natural selection.
And we observed how that singular biological theory just completely dismantled the teleological paradigm. It injected dynamic time and mechanical processes into geography.
which led to William Morris Davis conceptualizing landscapes through a biological cycle of youth, maturity, and old age.
Yes. And then we saw how it sparked the era of environmental determinism, where geographers attempted to attribute cultural differences strictly to climatic influences.
And how Ratzel scaled the biological struggle all the way up to the nation-state, conceptualizing Lebensraum, a theory that was unfortunately later absorbed into the aggressive geopolitical strategies of the 20th century.
But we also trace how Darwin's observations of interconnectedness birthed the science of ecology, ultimately leading geographers like Barrows and Sauer to reframe geography entirely.
Reframing it as the study of human ecology and the dynamic creation of cultural landscape. When you digest all of this, it fundamentally alters how you interact with the physical world. The next time you look at a map or observe a nation's borders, or even just look out the window at the layout of your own city, remember that you are not looking at a static, finished painting.
Not at all.
You are witnessing the current state of an ongoing, incredibly dynamic struggle for existence. You are observing a living ecological web shaped by deep time, environmental pressures, and human choices.
It reveals a world in constant flux. And, it leaves us with a really compelling historical counterfactual to consider.
What's that?
Well, we explored how early geographic thinkers deliberately stripped the concepts of randomness and chance out of Darwin's theory because they desired the comfort of deterministic laws. Laws that dictated human destiny and justify the geopolitical status quo.
Right, they demanded a predictable script, even after Darwin proved the universe wasn't operating with a director.
So consider this. If those early geographical and political thinkers had not ignored the mechanics of randomness, if they had fully embraced the idea that human borders, cultural dominance, and the rise and fall of states are heavily influenced by unpredictable variations and random historical chance, rather than an inevitable, destined survival of the fittest.
How might our geopolitical landscape look today?
Exactly. If we viewed national borders and human hierarchies not as the natural scientific right of the strongest, but merely as the temporary product of random historical fortune, would we draw the lines on our maps differently?
That is a fascinating thought. If the valley below us isn't a divine master plan, and it isn't an inevitable arena destined for the strongest to conquer, but rather a beautiful, random, and highly fragile ecological web, well, maybe we would treat it, and each other, a whole lot differently.